next speaker, who is coming from Novartis, so Baldur Magnusson, who will give us a talk on with great graphs comes great power. Very excited to hear, and Baldur, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me and see the slides as well. And thank you for inviting me to speak at the conference. I'm very excited to be here. Hello, everyone. My name is Baldur, and today I'm going to talk to you about a topic that I find one of the most exciting as a statistician in the pharma industry, and that is effective visual communication. So it connects nicely to Julia's excellent talk earlier, but what I'm going to be talking about is the graphs that you use to explain what you've done, to help others decide. Because I think that our job as a 21st century quantitative scientist, be that a statistician, a modeler, a data scientist, informatician, etc., is to influence our stakeholders through our analysis of the data. And I think the skill to be able to do that by communicating effectively through the visual medium is really one of the core competencies for our roles, because as the title of the talk states, with great graphs comes great power. So I'm passionate about raising the bar for myself in this regard, and also doing my bit to try and move the needle for effective visualization at Novartis and beyond. So given that, I figured it'd be good to rewind a little bit and take a look at how I got started in data visualization. And I'm not sure if this is something I should be admitting openly, but here we go. About 10 years ago, I managed to complete a PhD in statistics that somehow involved no graphing of real data. It didn't actually involve any real data at all. So you gotta love that theory, right? Well, that's fine, but then the next day, I all of a sudden find myself in this highly exploratory environment in early clinical development at Novartis. And for those that aren't sure what that space is, it's basically where you're transitioning compounds into the clinic for the first time. So first in human healthy volunteer studies and first in patient efficacy studies. And in that situation, it is critical to look at the data, literally look at it. And let's just say I sensed a gap in my skill set. And like any self-respecting professional, I turned to Google. And I was already an R user, so Google suggested, try ggplot2. And I thought, okay, why not? So I gave that a go, and I have to say I was instantly hooked. And actually, when preparing for this talk, I managed to dig up, I think maybe the first code snippet, or surely one of the first code snippets that I wrote as I was trying ggplot out. And looking at that, I think what got me hooked was the combination of flexibility and simplicity that you get from this layered approach, and just a small amount of code can produce something quite decent, even for someone that's just starting out in visualization. So like I said, I was hooked, and not just to ggplot2, but to data visualization, because as it turns out, plotting is fun. But I also quickly learned that it's not enough just to plot with abandon. We all know about a situation, either because we experienced it ourselves or because we saw it happen to someone else, where a presentation fell flat, a pitch didn't quite land, or a meeting got completely derailed because of poor data visualization. Unfocused plots, illegible plots with an unclear message. A bad plot can be worse than no plot. And producing a lot of graphs is not the same as effective visual communication. So in this talk, I'm going to share with you a few basic principles around effective visual communication that I think could help elevate everyone's graphical game and help us make an even bigger impact with our stakeholders. Now, the principles are good, but doing this well takes some practice. Great graphs, while powerful, are not trivial. One does not simply just plot the data. But it's clearly possible to develop this skill, because effective visualizations are in fact all around us. There are the ubiquitous election prediction plots from 538. There are the many various types of plots around the coronavirus pandemic produced by John Murdoch and his team at the Financial Times. And then even plots from the pharmaceutical context. I think this is a particularly effective Kaplan-Meier plot that clearly draws our attention to the therapy that works the best in this context. So what's the issue then? Well, let's look at an example to make things a little bit more concrete. Suppose our project team is interested in knowing the difference in exposure between Japanese patients and Caucasian patients, so exposure to our drug. And we're the quantitative person on the team, so we want to help out. We get our hands on the data, we calculate the summaries of the exposures in the two populations from dosing until some time point, let's say 48 hours, and we share this with the team as this plot. Surely this is sufficient. All the data is there, right? Anybody can see. But in that meeting, just imagine this. We show the plot and there is silence. And after a while, a colleague gently probes, excuse me, so is the exposure different? And as we hear that question, we realize the team can't tell. They want to know if the exposure is different, but from that plot, they can't see it. And looking at it, it's hard to blame them. The peaks are a jumbled mess, which might suggest that they are similar, but we can't really tell. The elimination seems faster in Japanese patients, but again, it's very hard to tell by how much and whether that's meaningful. So what is the team now supposed to conclude? This is a failed opportunity. We had a chance to influence our team, potentially drive immediate decision or action, but our visual, it was poorly thought through. It didn't address the team's question, and it left everybody confused and frustrated. And this isn't a rare occurrence. I don't have to look hard, at least at Novartis, to find more of these examples of graphs gone bad. Here is an interesting use of the y-axis, interesting use of the x-axis, and here I don't really know what we're supposed to conclude, but for me, I find this leaves a lot to be desired. And for full disclosure, I'm responsible for the first plot on this slide. I signed off on that in one of my early trials, so you live and you learn, and everybody makes mistakes, of course. But we generate more and more plots every day, but most are generated without thinking deeply about the underlying question. And often we err on the side of, yeah, I'll just put the data in there and let the team figure it out. And that's a real shame, because we all want our work to have purpose. We all want our work to be understood, and we all want to make an impact. But what if we could do better? And that's a rhetorical question, because I believe we can do better. And so I will rephrase. What if we consistently did better? What if our graphs, in addition to following good graphical principles, were carefully crafted with a particular scientific question in mind? They were designed for a particular audience, and they made them answers so obvious that there could be no confusion as to our position based on the analysis we conducted. That sounds like a pretty cool place, right? To me, that sounds like a place where our scientific influence is elevated through our effective communication, our effective visual communication. So how do we get there? Now, I will introduce 3 principles that I believe serve as a cornerstone of any effective visual communication. And these are: know your purpose, show the data clearly, and make the message obvious. Purpose, clarity, message. Let's talk a little bit about each of these. Okay, the first is know your purpose. We don't analyze data just for the fun of it. I mean, I don't know what everybody does in the evenings. Of course, there's Tidy Tuesdays, Wonderful Wednesdays, etc. But at work, at least, there's usually a reason for doing it, a decision that needs to be made, if you will. So before doing anything, ask yourself the following questions. First of all, what is the question? What is the scientific question or the business question that we're trying to answer with this analysis? Are we asking about side effects? Are we asking about a treatment effect? Maybe is it about comparing different options for going forward, or comparing exposures, as in the previous example? Who wants to know? It's important to adapt to your audience, and it's even more important not to assume that your audience will adapt to you. And so your visual, your communication may look completely different if you're just showing this to your quantitative peers, or your project team, senior decision makers in the company, or externals like KOLs or health authorities. And lastly, why do they want to know? Be clear on the expected outcome. Are we just sharing an analysis to facilitate a scientific discussion? Are we delivering a message? Are we trying to convince an audience? Are we facilitating a decision? Know the answers to these questions before you do anything else. Know your purpose. Next one is show the data clearly. And this seems obvious, but you'd be surprised at the innovative schemes we can come up with to show data badly. Just think of the slide I showed earlier with the 3 plots from Novartis. And so the first recommendation here is to simplify. Simplify to clarify. It's our job to make the complex simple. So choose the simplest appropriate graph, keeping in mind your goals and your audience. Next is maximize the signal over the noise. And that means mostly by getting rid of anything that distracts from the purpose, or the noise, that is. Colors, shapes, and line times and other attributes, these are noise unless they serve a clear purpose. And lastly, show the relevant data directly in the graph. Sometimes this is raw data, sometimes it's summary data, and sometimes if we fit a model for inferential or prediction purposes, it may actually make the most sense to show the model-derived quantities directly. But ask yourself, what's the best way of summarizing the relevant features of the data, keeping in mind your goals and your audience? Know your purpose and show the data clearly. And then tying it all together. After all that work on purpose and clarity, we do not want to show up to our meeting and have the audience play Where's Wally or Where's Waldo for the US people in the audience, where they have to stare at our graph for 5 minutes before they kind of figure out what we're trying to say, or before they just leave in disgust or confusion. And that's where the last principle is so important. Make the message obvious. Think back to purpose. What's the question? We have identified a question that needs to be answered. So our communication, our visual, should show the answer. So if the question is about a treatment effect or a difference from placebo, show the difference. And if for some reason you can't show that directly, at least place the quantities that are supposed to be compared as close to each other as possible to facilitate that comparison. The second is draw attention and do repeat yourself. So here I mean use contrasting colors and annotation and other attributes in the graph to draw attention to where you want it to be. Add meaningful information to provide context and to tell the whole story. And then do repeat yourself, but effectively. So if there are particular aspects of the graph that you want the audience to remember, then convey them in more than one place. And consider always adding a title, and really not just a description of what's in the plot, but phrase it as a conclusion. What do you think? And with these pointers, it's not so much that the message is obvious as it's really impossible to miss. Know your purpose, show the data clearly, and make the message obvious. Now, I do want to address the elephant in the room, which is that these principles, they seem obvious. Well, I hope that they do, but the reality is that they're not a silver bullet. There is no one-size-fits-all solution that's going to work in every situation. So the important thing is that you think consciously about each case and you make conscious choices depending on what's needed. And like I said before, this is a skill that can be developed. And so the suggestion is to make it a habit. Don't be afraid to experiment. Don't be afraid to fail from time to time, but make it a habit and test and repeat. So let's go back to our previous example where the question from the team was, is the exposure different? And if so, how? And suppose instead of bringing this graph to the meeting, which fell flat, left everybody confused and unsure, we internalized the principles of purpose, clarity, and message, and we brought this graph to the team. This graph summarizes the 48-hour exposure in terms of 3 important metrics: maximum concentration, trough, and AUC last. It shows the difference between the Japanese and the Caucasian populations in terms of ratios, relative to the vertical line at 1, meaning no difference. It states what we think in the heading. Exposure differs by ethnicity, but then uses annotation to point out that the peaks are similar, like we thought, but that the elimination is substantially faster in Japanese patients. And it even annotates the individual point estimates in case that would be helpful for some members of the team. This is a succinct message graph, specifically tailored to address the questions the team wanted answered. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's a whole lot better than what we saw before, and this one just might get the job done. So as I said in the beginning, our goal as 21st century quantitative scientists is to influence teams, our stakeholders, through our analysis of the data. And that influence necessarily involves communication, and the most effective medium for that communication is the visual. And with our friends' purpose, clarity, and message, we maximize our impact and we elevate our influence with our stakeholders. And as Spider-Man definitely once said, with great graphs comes great power. And so if you want to be more like Spider-Man, I want to leave you with a few resources to check these ideas further out. So we have a GitHub page on these principles where you can check out a video on effective visual communication and a tutorial that we wrote about it. And these slides are also posted on that GitHub page. We also have a graphics principles cheat sheet that you will hear more about tomorrow in Doug Robinson's keynote. And I also want to point you to an open source library on exploratory graphics for PKPD modeling. It's a very nice resource. And finally, just highlighting as well a couple of external sort of cross-company initiatives. There's the wonderful Wednesdays webinars run by the PSI Visualization SIG, and then the VisR initiative, which you will hear about in the talk that follows immediately after mine from Charlotta. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the many collaborators over the years. Allison, Mark, and Mark, the ones with stars next to their names, are the co-authors of the tutorial on these effective visual communication principles. But really, there are many others that I feel very fortunate having to work with over the years. People that are passionate about this just as I am. And really, it takes a village to really move this forward. And with that, I thank you. I apologize for the technical issues, but if we have any time, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Baldur, and thank you, through going so smoothly through, because of this technical difference. So I think we kind of handle it really well. We seem not to have questions for you, but I have to tell you the chat was so bubbly. So people are talking about how great the presentation was and could definitely relate to a lot of points you brought up. So that was really nice to see. So if people still have questions, just find Baldur on a Slack channel and ask them there. But otherwise, Thank you so much for giving this great presentation. I was giggling a lot of times behind the camera because you can find yourself in all these situations a lot, right? So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.